Hello, everyone. Thank you so much once again for joining us for this Drawdown Georgia interview series. I'm really happy to have our guest with us today. This is Jacob Yarbrough with Creature Comforts Brewing Co. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jacob. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Erica. I'm really excited for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Wonderful. Yes. So please introduce yourself to our audience and tell us about the work you all do at Creature Comforts Brewing.
So, as you said, my name's Jacob Yarbrough. I am the Senior Sustainability Manager at Creature Comforts Brewing Co. We are a craft beer company based in Athens, Georgia. We are, I think, as of 2025, one of the top 50 largest craft breweries in the United States, which is kind of wild. And my entire job is kind of looking at and asking questions: what is our environmental impact on the world around us, and how can we make that a bit better?
Awesome. Fantastic. Sustainability and climate are important issues with you all at the brewery. We talked quite a bit to folks here at the series about business and sustainability and how businesses are thinking about sustainability. So that's another reason why it's really good to have you here to talk more about that. So can you give us an overview of some of your efforts to reduce waste and emission at the brewery?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I always try to center is the product itself, right? We are making a physical good in the case of beer for consumers to enjoy. There are raw materials that go into our brewing processes. And so there is a tangible impact from, our energy sources that we use, things like natural gas, electricity, waste materials that we generate. And so I am all the time kind of acting as a bit of investigator, asking questions like, are we operating efficiently? Do we have to do things this way? Is there some other kind of material or process that we can substitute in that would have a bit of a lessening impact on some of those negative externalities from our processes?
That's really great to hear about the success you all have had with this. And I think we've seen an uptick in businesses taking sustainability and their climate impact into, consideration. Why is sustainability a core element of what you all do at Creature Comforts? Was that something that was a core element from the beginning, or is it something that you all developed over time?
Yeah, this is such a great question. There's so much to unpack here. I think the first thing that I would like to point out is, as a brewer, I depend on crops, right? I depend on barley grain, I depend on wheat, I depend on hops in order to, make beer and make my own living. And so taking care of sustainability is a business interest for us to make sure that our suppliers have dependable growing seasons, dependable amounts of rainfall, things like that. So mitigating climate change just on a business case makes a ton of sense for us. Then there's also the operational impacts of running a strong sustainability program. So something that I really focus on is eliminating waste, both in terms of solid waste, physical trash, things like that, but also like waste in processes, waste in utilities, things of that nature. So my work tends to pay for itself and then some, right? In terms of revenue saved for the company. Like pursuing a sustainability program, it can depend on what industry you're in, what services you're offering, right? But for us, it is a major cost savings to have sustainability programs. So you have these two kind of things going on, right? It's in our business interest to make sure our suppliers can continue to have dependable growing seasons. It's also, a cost saving center. And then we get into things like thinking about company values and things like that, right? One of our mission statement is to foster human connection, right? Creature Comforts wants to be there when you are celebrating with your friends on a Friday after work, things like that, right? And so we want to make sure that because we want to be there when people are celebrating, we want to be a company worth celebrating, right? And so then that means standing up and trying to do the best things that we can all of the time. And two, kind of to your point, Erica, lots of people are paying a lot of attention to where their dollars go. Times are getting tougher and people need to budget, and you need to make sure that you're spending dollars with companies that uphold your values as well. And so I think it's a big, complex question, but every direction I look at it, there are multiple reasons to stand up for sustainability in the private sector.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And my next question is about the Drawdown Georgia Business Impact that Creature Comforts is a member of. We had someone on here talking about the Business Compact a couple months ago. And it's definitely something that I'm, again, as someone who comes from the nonprofit sector, it's not my first thought, but it is something that we're seeing more of the connection that's necessary for kind of the advocacy and the businesses to be connected and how we're working on and thinking about climate and sustainability. As a member of the Georgia Business Compact, the Drawdown Georgia Business Compact, how has your business benefited from being a part of that entity? Why should other sustainability-focused Georgia businesses consider joining the Business Compact?
Absolutely. So something that's really handy about Project Drawdown and Drawdown Georgia specifically, right, is that it connects point A to point B, right? Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, we know we need to do something about climate change, right? And what Project Drawdown has done is say, hey, we have these emissions happening in these sectors. We think that these are solutions that we can work on to actually get us from we need to do something about it on the one side to look at what we have done. I think that's hugely valuable to potential members, right? Because you are not, as an individual company, responsible for developing and implementing every solution on your own, right? You get to join with a group of people, really smart people who work really hard and have thought a lot about these issues. So that's a benefit on one side, right? Is just the road mapping kind of piece of it. Then there's also, things like collaborations that can happen. Like when you get lots of people in lots of different organizations together, you can have these excellent conversations that sort of lead to maybe solutions and ideas you might not have thought of on your own. I also think that Georgia is specifically a leader here. I was doing some Googling, internet searching around to see we have Drawdown Georgia. Is there a Drawdown Alabama? No. Is there a Drawdown Florida? No. And so this is really kind of a way that we're stepping forward as a state to both provide, an infrastructure and a roadmap and a place for people to come and talk about these sorts of things, right? Bring these issues into the daylight.
We have been talking at Drawdown Georgia about the fact that there isn't another entity. Are there other places and things like this in other states? And I don't think that there are. And I don't want to misspeak, but, we talked a lot about, how do we become an example for other states that might want to implement something like this or lift up something like this. And it's so nuanced because it's this is led by a lot of, foundations and folks that feel like putting the funding and the resources behind something like this is important. And so it's where does that live? Does it live in academia? Does it live in philanthropy? So we talked a lot about that. So it's interesting that you say that and thinking about the benefits for businesses to be a part of something like this. We have academia, we have the NGOs, but also for businesses to be a part of something like this, to think about, to your point, point A to point B, how are we getting the work done? How are we sharing information with other businesses that want to do this as well? So yeah, I think Georgia is unique in that, and having that space to be able to have that conversation and having them all together that are able to have that, interconnectedness across sectors, I think is really important and unique.
Yeah, it's super valuable, right? You on the one side, you have the academics who are doing the great research and, finding out more about how climate change works and what's going on and what potential solutions are. You have excellent folks, like yourself who are doing the communication side, connecting people to one another. And then, businesses in so many different areas are responsible for so much emissions that they need to be part of the solution for a solution to be viable and to take, right? We have to participate.
So let's talk a little bit more detail about what it looks like for a business like Creature Comforts to reduce emissions. So can you start by explaining the different categories of emissions that businesses focus on? So kind of the scope, the 1, 2, 3 of emissions here.
So when it comes to tabulating carbon emissions, trying to do something about it, right? It's really important to contextualize where that emission comes from and how it functions within a larger system, right? And so that's why we talk about different scopes of carbon emissions. And so you mentioned 1, 2, and 3 to kind of explain for the audience really quickly, right? Scope 1 are emissions that you are directly responsible for yourself. So if I get into a gas-powered car and I burn gas to get from point A to point B, the burning of that gas would be a scope 1 emission for me. Right. Okay. Typically, a scope 2 emission is, in my understanding, energy related purchases. Specifically, most commonly, these are electricity purchases, right? So when you turn on a light switch in your house, right, the electrons come from the power plant to your lamp, light it up, and that power plant may have had, whether it's a coal-fired power plant or a solar farm or natural gas turbine, whatever the case may be, there may be some emissions associated with what they are doing. And like, I don't control the power plant, and so it's not a scope 1 emission for me. However, like, I turned the light switch on, right? So it's a bit different than a scope 1, right? So that's why
removed, a little more
exactly removed. There's an aspect of removal there, right? And as we move up into scope 3, right, there's additional removals that are happening, right? So a scope 3 emission is associated with your value chain, right? And so what I mean by a value chain emission here is like, so speaking as Creature Comforts for a moment, right? When we're going to brew a beer, there's a few things that we need, right? We need water, we need grain, we need hops. And so like the emissions that are associated with a farmer farming that grain, running his tractor, you know, spreading fertilizer, things like that, it's a scope 1 emission for the farmer, but it's a scope 3 emission for me. And the reason why we kind of like split things up this way is to make sure that we're not double or triple counting carbon emissions, right? Like those carbon molecules go up into the atmosphere, like we've already got too many of them up there, right? And so that's why we do the 1, 2, 3 scopes.
That's super helpful. And I think folks don't, especially as consumers, don't often think about how far that chain can go of emissions and how much energy, human energy, like literal energy, but also like human energy it takes to think about our chain of emissions. So thanks for explaining it that way. I think that's important.
Yeah, it's very complicated, right? Especially because too, right, when it comes to measuring something like carbon emissions, right, it's invisible, it's odorless, right? So it's really, really hard to kind of track and wrap your mind around. And so in my career, I found it very helpful to think like, all right, I have the most influence over what I am doing. And so that deserves the most focus right now.
Right. So Creature Comforts recently began focusing on lowering your scope 3 emissions that you were just talking about. So can you tell us about the steps you've taken in that area? How did you identify priorities? What changes had you already planned or do you plan to make?
So focusing on scope 3 is really hard. Right, like it's hard enough to understand your scope 1 and scope 2, and those are the ones you have direct control over for the most part, right? And so when it comes to scope 3, the first question is like, you know, how am I going to determine what these are? There are several different approaches that you can take. They are outlined. We specifically follow something known as the greenhouse gas protocols for corporate reporting standards. It's a foundational text in how to do greenhouse gas emissions reporting. When it comes to scope 3, we tapped into Drawdown Georgia and our organizational connections there. And I was connected with Professor Michael Oxman at Georgia Tech. We decided to do a great fellow. We decided to do a capstone project with a team of his students. And so, super, super helpful. Another benefit to working with Drawdown Georgia is, you know, I, in my day-to-day, would probably never have the time to dedicate research and project to something like this, but getting a team dedicated for this made everything so much better. And so when it comes to scope 3 emissions reporting, right, you often have to do a balancing act between completeness and accuracy and what information you can actually get, right? And so one of the ways we started with, hey, how much money are we spending with each of these suppliers? That was one approach, is using what's I think is a spend-based approach. And so we were able to get all of our suppliers in a file together, you know, the transaction histories and specifically what economic categories they acted in, right? So whether they were a grain farmer or, you know, a cardboard manufacturer or an aluminum can manufacturer, right? Different dollar spend is going to lead to different CO2 emissions. So it's important to have that economic activity tied there. And so the approach was pretty innovative, I thought, where, you know, we took BEA data. The latest available report on the EPA's website was from 2012. So a little bit out of date on that
Right.
side, but we are with this project kind of establishing where we are. So like first pass is okay. So from there, we took the approach of, okay, obviously dollars are not worth as much in 2024 when we engaged in this project as they were in 2012. So let's do
Right.
an inflation adjustment, right? To like kind of get these dollars to match up. And then from there, we ran through the economic analysis, right? Saying X dollars leads to Y grams of CO2, kind of pair that information together. So we had kind of what I would consider to be a first draft of our scope 3 emissions, right? This is a really good like beginning place. It's not a final version, again, because like we were working with some information that was a little bit out of date, and also I hadn't talked to any of my suppliers about this project. I imagined that there were probably some efficiency gains between 2012 and 2024, right?
Yeah.
And so that teed us up for the second stage of the project, which was where I took the emissions values that we had estimated and went directly to my primary suppliers and said, hey, this is something that we're working on. This is something that we care about. This is the information that we have and have established. What do you think about it? Do you have information? Like, does it look okay to you? Does it look wrong? Is there, more accurate information available from your own research?
Right.
Because what my scope 3 emissions are, well, my supplier, that's their scope 1, right? They have direct control.
Exactly.
They know a lot more about it. It was also really, really helpful to kind of have this rough draft in place, because all of a sudden I'm not asking them to solve all of my problems. I'm saying, hey, here's something I've got already. Like, does this vibe with you? Does this look okay? Or are you better off than that? And that process led us to some good findings, really. And, some of the information was, as I expected, not exactly the most accurate, but we were able to get updated emissions reporting and to give you a bit of a breakdown on how things kind of fall for a craft brewery like us. About 30% of our emissions are scope 1 and scope 2. So like in our direct control, 70% is scope 3.
Wow.
2/3 of it happens outside of your building. And to the second part of your question, right, what can you do about these sorts of things? The most impactful thing is to work with suppliers who share your values and are trying to improve their own emission chains.
Yeah.
We are pretty fortunate in the brewing industry that like most of our inputs, right, like our raw materials are agricultural products, right? So our supply chain tends to be pretty renewable to start with, right?
Okay.
Like our packaging format, right? Like you either get our beer in kegs, which are, shipped out from our facility to the bar, restaurant, whatever. People enjoy, people drink, they send it back to us. That is a circular package, which is really, really cool. The other packaging format is an aluminum can, which is the most recycled commodity in America.
Right.
And so I feel pretty good about the materials that we're working with, that there is a pathway to net zero in my industry. We have made a couple of supplier changes that were influenced, not completely influenced, right? The business case needed to be there as well, but where a more sustainable supplier actually won our business.
Oh, you're making such a good point here, because like Georgia is, and you may have mentioned this earlier, is an agricultural state as well. So like thinking about like how far are our agricultural materials coming, like how far away are they coming to us, like finding a Georgia supplier, and then finding a Georgia supplier that shares our values, and then finding like that also have their own sustainability values that they are following, and making sure that whether you all are delivering to the restaurants is the most sustainable, and then you also have the circular. Like it's so much to think about, but so important for the work that we're doing. And I think we talked to some folks on here also about who are working agriculture, and to think about how those folks are thinking about climate. I think you mentioned this earlier, because of ag obviously being one of the most important parts of agriculture is just things that you can't control, that you can't personally control, like climate. And so that whole circular conversation around how are we helping each other, how are we thinking about the ways in which we are contributing to it, I think is so important, especially in the business sense, but also in the sense from an advocacy and from a standpoint on our side as well, because we're thinking about how are we supporting some of these smaller farmers and the work that they want to do in helping their own, agricultural practices. So maybe there are ways that is connected, with the businesses that they support.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, Eriqah, right? Like something that I come across often in conversations about sustainability, right, is that like the relationship that I want to have with suppliers goes beyond just transactions, right? It needs to be like, we need to be ideally aligned in our values, the things that the kind of world we want to envision, right? The kind of future that we want to create. One of our values at Creature Comforts is to leave a legacy, right? So we're kind of thinking like, what kind of legacy are we leaving? How are we improving the future for other people? And I think that if we can be a part of developing a more sustainable framework, a more sustainable supply chain, more sustainable network, like something that Drawdown Georgia does, I think that is one of the best things that we can do as a company after, we've paid all the bills and the employees and everything.
Right. I also want to touch on something you mentioned about, the EPA report that you all were working from 2012. There are so many businesses, especially now kind of where we are in this moment in policy. There are so many businesses and so many other entities that are working with the information that the past information we had, because we're not getting anything currently that's going to help us, move further in some of our values and some of the ways in which we want to do. But also, we're working from past information. And so having to kind of make that adjustment, he talks about making that adjustment of like, what the savings are in 2012 is not what the savings are, in 2024, 2025, or 2026. And so I just wanted to note that, we're all working with the information that we have and doing the best we can. And that's another great thing you mentioned about Drawdown Georgia is like the research at institutions of higher ed and like academia that can help us fill in some of those gaps moving forward that we're not getting, in policy and federal policy right now. I think is so important. Work that folks are doing, at different schools like Georgia Tech with Michael Oxman and other really great professors and folks in academia who are trying to fill in some of those gaps that, we're not getting from some of our agencies that we may have gotten in the past, doing the best we can with what we have.
Right. And I think that's another strength of Drawdown Georgia. Just because federal priorities may change doesn't mean that reality changes.
Exactly.
And it's also too, right, pointing out the value of building up relationships as beyond being merely transactional, right? We are members of a community, we are members of a state, we are members of a society. And like, I personally think that like, I should try to make things better wherever I can and should try to spend time with people who have the same values there, right?
Yeah.
That's how we can really make some positive changes through force multiplication by joining together, right?
So what advice do you have for other Georgia businesses that want to reduce these types of emissions? I mean, it's hard work. Like you said, it's, reducing your scope 3 emissions is the hardest of the three, of course. So what advice do you have for other businesses that are really trying to think about how are they doing this work and how are they connecting what they're producing, whether that be a physical product like you all or other things, how are they connecting that to their values?
So first and foremost for business operations, first piece of advice is don't be afraid to try. Like oftentimes caution can prevent people from even attempting something. And so like just showing up and giving it a shot, like you're doing much better than people who are, not even trying, right?
Absolutely.
The second piece of advice, I think, is to understand your business operations, really getting into kind of the nitty gritty of your operations, because you might be surprised where you can find opportunities, where you can find waste. So taking the time to really evaluate, really look through and understand things like opportunities will probably present themselves because most systems aren't designed from the get-go to be as sustainable as possible, right? They're designed to get up and get going, which means that there's a lot of opportunity if you just really spend some time to look for it. So I think those are my first two pieces of advice. You don't have to dive into your supply chain immediately, right? Like you can focus on sweeping around your own back door first.
Yeah.
You've got way more control over those sorts of things. And also the impact will be more tangibly felt by your organization if you focus there first and foremost, right? And then once you get a few wins under your belt, get some support, that's when you can start kind of reaching out and like seeing what else you can do. So I think that's a piece of advice for, on the business side of things. And for what can folks do who, don't have maybe quite as many resources, I think number one is like connecting in your community. We're all members of communities, and seeing like, because there could be somebody who's already got something set up and they need volunteers, they need time, they need like people hours to get work done. So checking in with your community is a piece of one if you don't have, a local community, or like maybe trying to find one. And then a third piece of advice, I think, right, like, is educating yourself, learning about some of these issues, right? So, your local library, fantastic place, tons of resources, tons of information. The books are free, right? And so that's a really good place, I think, to start, especially if you don't like, if you want to try to make a difference. Also, it's totally fine to narrow your scope, right? Like, you don't need to fix the world yourself. You can find an area that you care about and make a difference, right? Like, thinking about my own work and my own career, right? Like, I care about people connecting, getting together, celebrating over a delicious beer, whether it's a Creature Comforts or a competitor, doesn't matter to me. And, I've been able to cut our water use by 500,000 gallons a month. Major impacts, just like finding something you care about and working at it relentlessly. You'll find some major impacts wherever you apply yourself.
I love that. That's really great. And I think, some of the things that you said are good for us as individuals and also good for businesses. Finding our community as individuals is just as important as I think as business owners finding their community. Drawdown Georgia Business Compact is a community of folks. And I think that education piece also of being able to connect. Not only we love libraries are fantastic, and for businesses and individuals, and finding the education at the Business Compact. And I know you all have a lot of ways that you're connecting and educating and meeting together to gather and talk about the work and talk about, the ways in which you all are doing that work and educating each other. And I think that's so important for business owners, but also for folks that are doing work in community as well. So I think a lot of what you just said is interchangeable for all of us and really important.
There are folks out there who maybe don't want other people pursuing climate solutions, right? Thinking like, one of the strategies to kind of engender hopelessness and inaction is a divide and conquer strategy, right? And so if you say, no, I will not be divided, I'm going to stand with other people in my community who care, then like you have way more resilience there.
The individualism is the part that's really going to get us. So we have to band together. I say that all the time. So you are preaching to the choir for me. Thank you so much for this conversation. This was really educational for me. I know it was really educational for our audience. And so I'm really thankful to you and the other folks who have come and talked to us about stuff like this. We're at our last question. It's my favorite question. So I can't wait to hear your answer about it. What's giving you hope around climate in Georgia?
There is a phrase that I'm a fan of, right? Which is reality has a way of asserting itself. And I feel like we are in a moment where reality is, if it's not already asserting itself, it's starting to assert itself. And when reality asserts itself, right, like people who may be not paying attention to something, whether that's disinterest or comfort or whatever the reason may be, they start to pay attention, right? And so with that framing in mind, something that really gives me hope right now. So I'm going to introduce kind of a wonky acronym or saying this is something known as the levelized cost of electricity. What the levelized cost of electricity is a metric that kind of measures, how much it costs to build a power plant, how long that power plant will exist, how much it costs to operate that power plant. And then you kind of divide that or, figure in how much power you're going to get out of it. And then you get a price per kilowatt hour, price per year, however you want to express that metric, right? That's the levelized cost of electricity. And I mentioned that that's really important because the levelized cost of electricity for solar plus storage is the lowest of all forms of electricity now. Which means that if you're building a power plant, the one that has the best value is the most sustainable power plant. And this is a way that I think reality is kind of asserting itself, where it's like, if we're talking about our grid, if we're talking about where we get that electricity from, now the greenest option is the most prudent one to invest in, right? Like,
interesting.
There's not much of a point in, keeping coal plants open. for example, right? So that's one thing kind of on a macro level that really is giving me hope is like, man, some big trends that I see are, it just makes sense, right? It just makes sense. On more local levels, right? We are seeing things like, at the time of recording in March of 2026, like half of the United States is going through absolute record heat waves. Summertime is hot. Should every summer be hotter than the one before it?
Right.
I think that as more people kind of experience more direct impacts of climate change locally in their lives, right, reality begins to assert itself. More people want to get on board with doing something about this problem. Right. And so it's kind of, right, like, I do think that there are some maybe not so great days ahead, but there is a light through that tunnel, right? Yeah. And that is something that I think will kind of galvanize more people to act and to demand better. That's the other piece that gives me hope, is that like these problems, these solutions, connecting people together, we can demand better than what we have now. And so kind of an unorthodox answer to what gives me hope. But right now in this moment, that's really what I'm seeing. And that's given me hope, is that like, man, reality is beginning to assert itself and we should do something about that.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's unorthodox at all. And I really like your approach to it. That's really important for us to think about the ways that we are connecting with each other on the realities that we are seeing.
Absolutely.
So that we can do the work that needs to be done in all industries.
I encourage people to talk about the problems that they see, right? Yes. Because as we talk about problems and we vocalize problems, then like, it becomes more salient, it becomes more important. People want to start thinking about, well, that's a problem. How can we solve it? Right. Yes. That's the page that I want to try to get people to turn, is like from the, oh man, this is a problem, to, and here's how we begin to work on solutions.
Thank you so much, Jacob, once again, for being with us, for talking to us about Creature Comfort Brewing. Congratulations to you all on all the success that you've had, both in your business and the business itself, but also in, aligning your values with what the work that you're doing. I think that's really great. And I'm not really a beer drinker, but I think there's other ways that I can support y'all, but I'm not, but I'm eager to learn more about the work that you're doing.
Well, something that I would like to say, Eriqah, is that we recognize that not everybody is a beer drinker, which is why we are moving into other product lines, spirits, seltzers, things of that nature, right? And so we are kind of thinking for the future, right? Less brewery and more beverage company, right? Because everybody needs something to drink.
Everybody needs something.
I would also like to give you a thanks for having me, and thank you for hosting these webinar series and communicating with people and connecting with people. I think that something, in this moment in America, lots of folks want us to be isolated, and the work that you are doing is an active, resistance to that. And I think it's really, really important. So I appreciate everything that you've done.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That's nice to hear. I think that you're absolutely right. And in a world post-COVID, and not really post-COVID, COVID is ever continuing, but kind of the height of it, when we were all locked in the house, things have gotten so much more digital. And the way that, we're having more Zoom calls, we're having more of these where we're hosting shows, just online. And so we're getting less time to be in community physically with each other. And so I appreciate you saying that. First of all, I appreciate you saying that, because this has been really a joy of mine over the past year and some change. But also I appreciate you saying that, because it underscores the necessity for human connection, and this necessity for us to connect on the work that we're doing, and the necessity for us to connect on our values. I think it's so important. Finding ways where in the digital space we can still be together is really important.
Absolutely, right? These digital tools can help enhance community, or they can help break community apart.
Exactly.
Right? The digital tools aren't going away. And so I think it is super, super important for people to use tools for good and for connection and for problem solving, right?
Thanks, Jacob. I appreciate you once again. And once again, congratulations to Creature Comforts. And thank you all for joining us once again for this Drawdown Georgia interview series. We hope to see you next time for our next Georgia climate leader doing fantastic work in our wonderful state. Thanks again. Bye-bye now.